Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. The coronavirus death toll in the United States topped 5,300 as we tape this podcast, and another 3 million Americans applied for unemployment insurance. With an aircraft carrier moored out of commission off Guam because of coronavirus aboard, the administration has warned Iran and its proxies from attacking U.S. forces in Iraq, dispatched ships and aircraft to the Caribbean to fight drug traffickers, and continues to suggest that China could move against Hong Kong or Taiwan as early as next month. And Russia and China have both prominently delivered masks, ventilators, and other medical supplies to the United States, with an Antonov 124 landing yesterday at JFK Airport in New York City. China and Russia have also been equally active in shipping medical supplies to Italy and other nations devastated by the virus. Joining us today is a big group to talk about these big issues. Joining us are Dr. Gordon Adams of the Quincy Institute, Byron Callan of Capital Alpha Partners, Mackenzie Eaglin of the American Enterprise Institute, Todd Harrison of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Terry Schultz, a Brussels-based journalist who reports for Deutsche Welle and National Public Radio, former Pentagon Comptroller Dr. Dov Zakheim, who is now affiliated with CSIS, and retired U.S. Navy Commander Chris Cervello, who's on our team. Guys, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Vago.
Thanks, Vago.
Thank you, Vago.
And before we start, a very special thanks to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri, Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage, and of course, Bell sponsors our podcast. Guys, let's talk a little bit about this. We're $6 trillion in with stimulus packages. Another $2.2 trillion in the CARES package was approved last week, and we discussed that on both the Washington and the business roundtables. At the same time, there are concerns that the president may not have handled this crisis as well as he could, and may be talking up external threats as a distraction from the criticism at home. Let's start more broadly. Mackenzie, start us off, because it's been a horror show of a week, whether it's with the unemployment figures, whether it's Congress talking about a fourth stimulus package as well. There are going to be hearings into, certainly on the House side, about what went wrong with this on a week that the president finally acknowledged that this is going to be a devastating crisis, and that up to 240,000 Americans may end up dead at the end of this. Talk to us, as you have been talking to your sources, and how you've been thinking about this from a national security perspective overall. And I want to kind of go down the line and get everybody's take on this, and note that Terry is going to jump in and jump back off because she's covering the NATO ministerial.
Thanks, Vago. What I see is a nation almost paralyzed, with the exception of medical communities and some companies trying to help, with fear and a lack of consistent, overly vocal leadership at the top, providing information at a steady with a steady hand and presence, and so that contributes to it. I see Defense Department leadership very reluctant to get involved beyond the traditional, support to federal, state, and local authorities when needed, and occasionally to aid organizations to help with logistics and distribution of whatever, like we see often with floods, hurricanes, blackouts, wildfires, etc. This is pretty typical defense stuff, but you see a department reluctant to jump all in because they are worried about what's happening in the world, and they are trying to stay committed to the defense strategy, which is not, I worry about how that's going to hold up. The more scared America's getting, the greater the calls and the instinct for everyone to say, call in the cavalry, as in let DOD take over. And I wonder how long the Secretary of Defense can thread that needle of saying, no, we're only a support agency here, which obviously statutorily is true, but the volume of activity related to this, as was evidence in the stimulus for DOD, they're not doing a lot. $10 billion and $2.2 trillion means DOD is doing virtually nothing at this point to help, very, very little. But that's obviously going to change. And you'll see that in the fourth stimulus, as shocking as that is. And I see a White House reluctant to invoke all of its authorities. Usually, this is a national emergency that usually falls under security and defense legislation, like like, for example, the Defense Production Act. And that hesitation on the White House's part has also led to this horrific shortage of PPE and medical supplies and equipment everywhere. Even now, I think we're going to see Guard members run out because their own stockpile has been given away, and the national medical stockpile is depleted. So what you see is, looking back, everybody moved too slowly on the part of the feds. And I think that what is going to happen, the consequence of that will be DOD is going to end up doing way more than they signed up for. And we can get to it later, but that's kind of manifest with the aircraft carrier in Guam.
We should say that a lot of folks have been, military folks and people in the department have been worried about getting out ahead of the White House, because I know that, talking to my sources, in January, there was concern that the crisis in China was infinitely worse than anything that was reported, that the death rates were much, much higher, and that folks, even in early January, were talking about whether we will have enough ventilators, masks, gowns, and supplies on hand, for our own use, much less be able to help anybody else. So that also is kind of a dynamic factor in this calculus. Gordon, let me go to you and get your take on that as we go through the line and try to get everybody's thoughts on what has been a very, very stunning and complicated week.
Well, this, of course, is an unprecedented event in American history. So any expectations that we have about this being sort of recognizable and definable at this point in time are practically off the table. I'm very struck as a parent that my children and my grandchildren, for them, this is going to be their Depression and World War II all wrapped into one. The impact on this for the rest of their lives is going to be stunning. The impact on the economy is going to be totally stunning. It is a non-paralleled event, except perhaps for those two big and in some ways quite different events, because this adversary, a stimulus package is not going to make this all better right away, because it's not really about the economy, it's about health. And even if one invoked every, 2 million people in the United States military, this is not their bag. It's not clear exactly what they will do, and will be throwing them into the breach in something that they're utterly unprepared for. So first off, it's a massive thing. Secondly, what's stunning to me really is to watch three things happening simultaneously. And this extends a metaphor everybody's familiar with, but we got an airplane that's flying, the US government doing a crisis. At the same time, we have inside that very same airplane some people busily unscrewing things, taking the seats out, undoing the bolts, stripping the fuselage, taking the wings off, and a whole nother bunch of people adding wings, turning on bolts, making the thing fly again. So we're both dismantling and remantling the state, the government apparatus, as we fly the damn thing. So there's an incredible amount of improvisation happening here. The third thing I think to keep an eye on is, to the extent possible, and the feds have blown this completely in my judgment, but thank God for federalism. In a stunning kind of way, the ability of governors, Republican and Democrat, to step up at the state level and extend as far as they possibly can their own authority, and get really public about it as they go. We may have discovered that the real strength of America lies in the federalism that was created so long ago, because the governors are stepping in where the federal leadership has just abandoned the field. It's very hard to take this all in at once. But the one point I did want to make is one that I know we will come to in this conversation, and that is that the inability of the United States government to actually deal on the international level with this is also equally stunning. We have a rather general breakdown of multilateralism in any case, and this administration has gone a long way to making that happen. But even in the EU, they're having multilateral problems. NATO is clearly not being an effective responder in any way. And this, again, is not its bag. It's not a health organization. But, even in the Security Council of the United Nations, it is stunning that over now a 3-month period, nobody has really stepped up at the totally international multilateral level to say, how do we need to coordinate? How do we need to help each other? And so we've got a lot of countries stepping in, The Chinese have been stepping in, the Russians, oddly enough, stepping in. I think they're probably underplaying their data too. But stepping in at the international level in the way the United States has abjectly failed to do. Not only failing to exercise any form of leadership here, but as you pointed out at the beginning, Vago, vigorously stirring the pot of conflict. Vigorously stirring the pot of conflict, whether it's with the Iranians or in Venezuela, or this manifestly unnecessary business about deploying additional forces for counter narcotics in the Caribbean, or even as simple as trying routinely to turn the Chinese into an enemy instead of an opportunity that we have here and ought to be exploiting for mutual cooperation where we can. The abject failure, both domestic and internationally, of the United States government here is stunning. And we really don't know how deeply badly that is going to play out for Americans or for the international regime that survives the virus.
Terry, I know that you're on a very, very short turnaround. Let me ask a couple of compressed questions as you heard from Gordon as well. And I know that Dove wants to address this from an alliance perspective as well. Talk to us about the key takeaways from this virtual NATO ministerial that's going on. Obviously, COVID is a concern there. How the Russian and Chinese rhetoric are playing out, given how involved both countries have been to try to give aid to countries in Europe, and the EU's response as well, how the European Union is responding.
Well, NATO has been under pressure to really find its role here. And the interesting thing about Brussels is that sometimes coordination works really well inside NATO, which can't get off the ground on the other side of town in the European Union. And this is one of those cases where supplies were suddenly found in the Czech Republic for Italy and Spain. For medical suits, when a request was made on the EU side, funny, they didn't find them. So NATO has some structures in place that can be called into use in this situation, like its shared strategic airlift capacity, which some allies buy into, and some other disaster response programs, platforms, and that's what's been happening. And they've tasked SACEUR, Todd Walters, the Supreme Allied Commander, to basically look at what's available in terms of both capacity and supplies, and then to come back in a couple of weeks with a defense ministerial that's going to be scheduled and let everybody know how capacities are matching up. Now, a lot of this is done simply by allies requesting to NATO, kind of like a switchboard, to help switchboard what they need, and then other countries telling what they've got available, and then finding out if there's a shared capability. We have seen, warships kind of hanging out in the North Sea. We have seen the need for more scrambles lately, and Russian warplanes buzzing NATO airspace. So that, in addition to now the very easy propaganda opportunity that Russia has had by providing supplies to Italy and now the United States, that's been a big concern, and I think that it puts NATO in a hard place, because in both cases, both with Italy and the United States, two of the largest and wealthiest allies, you had them needing to ask Russia for help. So, I mean, it's just, to me, sort of a real PR headache for NATO, because that Russia can use this to say, look, NATO can't provide for its citizens, and they need our help, who's more powerful here. So that's really, not a good narrative for NATO to have to defend. But in the press conference that we had after his, sort of virtual press conference we had after the meeting, I didn't get to ask my question about how worried they are about having to combat that. But we have seen also more cyber attacks, more efforts to plant stories in allied countries. Lithuania had an issue with this, so that is a big concern. And I think that behind the scenes they'll be working on that a lot. But there's just, trying to put out the most the most dangerous fires first, and that is getting medical supplies to countries that need them. So that I think that's their priority. But the U.S. Iran dispute that's seen quite bilaterally it hasn't been front and center here in Europe at all. People are really very focused on crisis response. I have to say that a lot of the issues that we would be talking about on a daily basis, a lot of the threats and the dangers out there, Iraq, ISIS, what the heck is going on in Afghanistan, should we be pulling troops out? All of those kind of questions would be something I would be following on a daily basis before this time. We're just living through, times that are unprecedented and everything is skewed.
Terry, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Vago.
Dov, I want to go now to you and get your sense, given that you've been also working your not just extraordinary national source base, but global source base as well.
Well, I was just speaking to someone who's been attending the ministerial, and what struck me is how NATO really hasn't been doing very much. There's an organization called the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center. Big word, doing very little. It's a NATO organization. And all it's been doing, and by the way, the first report that it issued only appeared yesterday. All it's been doing is essentially telling everybody what people want and then reporting what people are doing. And it's amazing how little people are doing. And of course, the United States doesn't appear in this at all. And so you've got a situation where, yes, this is not a military thing. And it's all very nice to talk about airlift. But the question is, what are you airlifting and who's making contributions? And then that's where the Russians come in. That's where the Chinese come in. They're actually contributing something. Here's an organization that could help work alongside the EU or do something that the EU can't do to be the most efficient coordinator to know who needs what the most urgently and then get it to them. And NATO's not doing that. Maybe they will. They're going to have a defense ministers meeting in a couple of weeks. The United States is AWOL. And this has been mentioned. Gordon mentioned this. We have totally, our whole approach, at least at a federal level, is purely political. If you're a friend of the president, you get masks, you get ventilators, you get this, you get that. If you're the wrong party, well, you may get something if you're lucky. The governors are working directly with manufacturers because going through the federal government doesn't seem to do anything. And then if you look at what happened on the Theodore Roosevelt and how 4,000 plus people are being evacuated, you've got to ask yourself, can the United States on its own, without coordinating with allies, or even if it did coordinate, could it come to the assistance of its allies if it's hit by another epidemic like this one? Where are we going to have the capability? Who else will have the capability? If we aren't totally coordinated and efficient, how do we deal with an act of aggression? And by the way, in the middle of all of this, and with all due respect to North Macedonia, we just accepted another NATO ally, 30 NATO allies. Are they all going to be defended equally? What's going on here? It's almost like we're operating in parallel universes without thinking about the reality that I would have thought, as the people who've already spoken would have said, the reality that the virus imposes on us. So we are totally absent, both domestically at a federal level and internationally, as Gordon said.
I want to come back around on this thought, but just to let everybody know, we had Bob Work, as some of you know, on the show on Monday, and it's a two-part conversation. On Friday, we're going to air the second part of that conversation. The first one was on COVID, and one of the things that Bob raised was, for those of you who may not know in the audience, Bob Works as former Deputy Defense Secretary and one of America's leading strategists. So one of the points he made is he pointed to an Italian lawmaker who sort of made the case that the moment of American leadership has passed and that an era of Chinese leadership has dawned, which is certainly a devastating message to be sending, in part because Italians do feel abandoned even by their closest friends in Europe who haven't been transferring as much medical equipment there as they could. But I want to come back to that issue. Todd, give us your sense, because you've got a little bit more of a budgetary issue that you want to bring to the table. And then I want to hear from Byron and then from Chris as well.
Well, yeah, let's go micro for a second here and focus, specifically on how this affects the U.S. Department of Defense. With this $2.2 trillion stimulus bill, there was a little money in there for DoD. I say a little, it's $10.5 billion. So it's not little in that respect, but it's a very small portion, less than 0.5% of the total funding in that bill. I would note that I've gone through it, looked at where the funding goes. It goes where you would expect it to go. There's some MilPERS funding in there for National Guard and Air National Guard. There's a lot of O&M funding and all the different services, O&M accounts. The only procurement funding in there is in the Defense Production Act purchases line, and it's not specified what that would be used for. So it's kind of where we expect to see it going. About 2/3 of that $10 billion is going to defense-wide accounts. So a lot of this will be centrally managed. And that's because of all the extra funding. Nearly $5 billion is going to the Defense Health Program. We've got some money coming into DoD, but all the rest of the funding that DoD has, they're actually may have trouble executing some of it, not just because of a slowdown in industry, because workers can't necessarily get to work and continue and be as productive as they would have been normally, but also there's been a real slowdown in recruiting and accessions into the military. So the services are not likely to meet their end strength targets by the end of the year. They're not going to meet their recruiting goals. And so we're probably going to see some extra MilPERS money build up in those accounts that they will be looking to transfer. That's 1-year money. They'll be looking to transfer it in the coming months to other things where perhaps they can execute it. So for the time being, DoD, I would say, is pretty well stocked with cash, probably going to have difficulty spending what it already has. But looking a few years down the road, we got to remind ourselves that now that this $2 trillion stimulus has passed, we know that revenues are going to go way down because of this economic downturn. We already had a pre-existing deficit for the year of over $1 trillion. We're easily looking at a deficit for FY20 of $3 trillion, maybe more. Record-setting deficits. I mean, we're talking back to World War II levels of deficit when you adjust for inflation. So what does that mean long-term for DoD? It's not good. When we've seen record-setting deficits like this in the past, eventually it catches up. Folks, once the economy starts to recover, people start to get worried about all the government spending and the deficit, and they start to tighten the belt. And when they're going to be looking to tighten the belt a couple of years from now, history suggests that some of those cuts are going to come to DoD. And so I think that the department would be wise to start thinking now about how do you position yourself for a future budget environment in the next 2 or 3 years that could very well be, quite constrained relative to what we have right now.
Byron, I want to go to you because you've got some novel sort of takes on where, not just on the defense side of things, but also the broader economic ecosystem and exactly how devastating what's to come may be. I think people think it's bad now. It could get a lot worse.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of excellent points have been made. I mean, just to throw a couple of more carrots into the pot here, 4 things that I'd be thinking about. The 2020 election has really just kind of been swept under the table here. It's not just the presidential race, but I'm intrigued to see now some of these Senate races look like they're going to be a lot tighter. And there's a increasing probability that there'll be a Democratic majority in the Senate as a result of the 2020 election. So that's one thing to think about. This is obviously a pandemic that's kind of, moving around the United States and around the world. It's going to be interesting. You can all look at the charts, the data that shows when this will peak. As it moves into the southern parts of the United States, the kind of red states, that kind of maybe blows back into the first part of the observation about where the impact could be from that in the 2020 election is some of these very strong red states really have to now grapple as they kind of move into the eye of the storm. And I think the other part that's that I get worried about is just really the fragility of some of the very large states. Iran has clearly been kind of front and center in this, but Afghanistan, Pakistan, India's on total lockdown. Brazil is going to be really fascinating to see how this kind of maybe rips through Brazil, and what that just does to this overall notion of state stability and how it may yet influence the way the U.S. thinks about the world and the national defense strategy, which was really pointed at China and Russia. To Mackenzie's point, I think, this whole question of the Defense Production Act and kind of, we just have not done national mobilization really since 1950. And obviously prior to that in 1940, 1941. And I think that's been, blazingly absent from the approach of how these different industrial resources are being mobilized to deal with the crisis. I was on a webinar earlier today that was dealing with how the automotive sector was responding to medical need, and same question kept coming up. There's no kind of national coordination, so you're who's sorting out that you're kind of reducing duplicative efforts and making this the most efficient approach possible. And I'll finally just conclude, I'm still intrigued with the longer term opportunities, and frankly, some risks are going to emerge for defense contractors, for industry in general. This is going to reshape national priorities. It could create some new competitors, frankly, as these approaches, systems merge together. But it may create some opportunities. The defense services companies may have a whole new range of opportunities that open up, depending on what comes out in things like unemployment insurance, the healthcare system. But equally, as these technologies merge, the automotive supplier issues that I raised a second, there's some very intriguing overlays that yet could spill in the defense sector. So I think all these contractors are going to be looking at a much more dynamic environment, not just one that, as Todd pointed out, is going to be shaped by the direction of the defense budget, but kind of what is happening underneath that defense budget and where new priorities are going to emerge.
I love the arsenal of health, which is a great play on World War II. But obviously, right, car makers playing a key role in this. General Motors working with Ventec on ventilators and hopefully having deliveries next month. But there's been innovation globally, right? I mean, Dyson has developed a very lightweight unit as well, something that's coming purely from commercial industry at the end of the day, but also that automakers have this sense of existential dread that they didn't have after 9/11, that their factory, that people may not be buying cars, people may not be using cars, and depending on what happens afterwards, folks are not just going to go out and make a big ticket purchase.
But Bobby,
like that.
You're aware because you participated in some of this stuff, but I think we're really realizing that this whole idea about lean and just not having excess capacity to deal with a crisis, you're seeing this in the healthcare system. I think people ought to be thinking about this for the defense industrial base or the national manufacturing and technology base that could address a security crisis that you could say easily the same sort of shortages come up in a very different context for national security. That's another issue to play with. But this idea about let's just operate stuff lean and efficient, there's some very grotesque inefficiencies that can come about from that kind of thinking.
Exactly, and I should note for our audience that Byron and I both participated in a National Defense University, an Eisenhower School project on that now almost 2 years ago. Chris, I want to bring you into this conversation. You and I talk regularly. You've got a whole series of colleagues, mentors, and mentees that you're dealing with on a regular basis as DoD works through the messaging for all of this. We covered. You joined us to have that conversation with Brian McGrath on what happened on Teddy Roosevelt and the expectation that the Navy should support the commanding officer of the ship. Talk to us a little bit about some of the thoughts that you've got off the top, some of which are actually remarkably humorous.
One of the disadvantages of going last with such a star-studded panel is most of the big thoughts have been expressed and have been expressed very well. Let me just punctuate it with this, and this is what we were talking about earlier. And I think this expresses the view of a lot of the people that I talked to in the Pentagon. In the midst of an international pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people are going to die, in a 2 to 3 day period this week, we had the commanding officer of a nuclear aircraft carrier pleading in the San Francisco Chronicle for help for his sailors. We had a Russian relief plane unload humanitarian supplies in New York City. And we expanded the drug war in U.S. Southern Command in the midst of all this. My feeling is that when you look at all of this, I mean, it really is something out of a bad sci-fi or Michael Bay movie. And the joke that I made to you is I'm waiting for Gerard Butler to come crashing through the ceiling to save us from this. I mean, I don't know that certainly in my lifetime I've ever felt anything so just so dramatic and for folks in the military to feel so helpless at the same time. Now, there are reasons for that, and I don't think it has to be that way. Somebody needs to grab a hold of the rudder and, to use Gordon's analogy, to get a hold of this aircraft before it crashes into the side of the mountain.
Well put. And I'm trying to imagine, Gerard Butler sailing, riding in to save the day. But unfortunately, it ain't that easy. And this isn't a movie. And we're, at the first chapter of sort of a 5-chapter play at this point. And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more. How should the department be positioning itself for a build down at this point, right? What are some of the things the department has to start doing right now to make sure it doesn't end up on the back foot as it goes about this? The department can make believe that it's going to get $760 billion next year or 750. And they've got to start to have a plan on what's important, what's not, what are the trade-offs I'm going to make. And they've got to start doing that right now to have some mental model so that they don't end up being overwhelmed with, hey, I'm sorry, we've just added $10 trillion to the debt. The economy is going to be soft. Tax revenues won't be there. Guys, we're going to have to come and take $200 billion from you, and that's just the way it's going to be. Right? That's how this is going to play out, I think, ultimately. And that's why, Gordon and Dov, I'm interested in what you guys have to say, because Gordon, you were in the Obama administration, you were in the Clinton administration when the Cold War ended, and you guys had to make some very, very hard, but still very pragmatic cuts. And Dov, you were at DOD when the money spigots were being turned up, but the entire time I knew you when you were comptroller, you were just saying, like, nobody's going to keep adding to our budget, so we're still going to have to make some tough choices to live within the top line. And then we had that great innovation called the supplemental that blew the doors off of that concept. But, Mackenzie, start us off on how, you've been on many national defense commissions and panels that have looked and not just assess national security, but also how to make ways and means work. What does the department need to be doing, and how does the department need to be thinking about this so that it's not a train wreck at the end of Congress, by literal necessity, have to turn to the department and say, I'm sorry, I got to take a massive amount of money away from you?
Sure. So the first thing the Defense Department needs to prepare for is answering questions about why it was seemingly caught flat-footed. If the Naval War College and others have done all these war games and tabletop exercises predicting a pandemic and what it would look like, and it's playing out pretty similarly, others around the world have done the same, and even organizations here in DC. Okay, so everybody knew this was coming, so why wasn't it a priority? The defense strategy doesn't bring it up. What's going on here? And then they're going to have to answer about the response. There's slow motion gearing up to support feds, states, and local authorities response so far, which each day, each hour, each minute really truly does cost lives. There is a parallel to war here. And why was the department so slow to help? Those are the immediate questions. Over the longer term, yes, the Grim Reaper known as the debt bomb will eventually squeeze defense. There's no doubt about it, but I don't see the uniformed or civilian leaders publicly ceding that ground yet after fighting so hard for so long to get a budget that buys the defense strategy and still doesn't do that. asking for 3 to 5% growth, and they're getting basically negative real growth of a point a year. So I don't think anyone's going to stand up and say, well, I hope, I assume defense leaders will not take a page from the Robert Gates playbook and say, well, President Obama, we hear you're worried about the deficit because of the Tea Party. Here's $400 billion from defense that you can have up front, free and clear, and now we've done our part. And Obama said, that's a great idea, Secretary Gates. I'm going to do it again. And along came BCA to take $800 billion in planned spending from DoD. So the lessons of the past will be not to give that ground up yet. But yes, planning, sure, Vago, they got to do it behind the scenes. They've got to start doing the dreaded 3 budgets that we saw leading up to sequestration that people like poor Christine Fox and Ash Carter and others and Bob Work had to live through. If we get this, what we hope to get, best case scenario, which is the fit up, but what if we don't, and levels downward from there? I think that's true. They need to plan now for that, probably a year to 24 months from now.
I want to just say, I don't think anybody was necessarily gleeful, and there were a lot of people who thought that the Budget Control Act, right, that we would have gotten to a fiscal deal that avoided that, right? So I don't think it was just like, yeah, let's go. I get to take another $800 billion from defense, because $800 billion was also taken from just about everything else.
Fair enough, except Vago, President Obama said it to a defense audience, mostly in uniform, with the Speaker of the House sitting in the front row, who he gave no notice to, saying, this is what I'm going to do. So I'm not saying it was gleeful, but it was pretty direct. And it was like, yeah, great. So you gave us your, almost $500 billion. Who cares? We're going to take some more. He called it a piggy bank, the Defense Department budget, at another point in time.
Great. Understood. But I think that there was, right, if people weren't trying to burn the fiscal house down to cleanse us by fiscal fire, we would not have been in that situation, right? Borrowing rates were still extraordinarily low.
I said the Tea Party was pressuring him.
Right.
Yes.
It was not. They were getting ready to default the nation, and the nation went into a partial default as a consequence of it, which was sort of an end of history event. I mean, I don't want to relitigate that, but I think that there were very concrete a set of things that happened that put us into that unfortunate position that we're still living with. Gordon, give us your sense, given that you were part of an administration that had to, sort of the handwriting was on the wall.
Well, it's what's interesting about this is that the handwriting was on the wall even before the Clinton administration, and that there's a real lesson in that. Thing one is leadership, leadership, leadership. You cannot discount the importance of people who set a direction. I think the fact that Barack Obama set a direction is an important data point, not a critique, it's just a data point. So what clearly had happened at the end of the Cold War is that the leadership of the Defense Department, probably one of the toughest secretaries of defense that we've ever had, Dick Cheney, and Colin Powell, literally set about restructuring the plan for American military forces and taking money out of the projected plan. They took it out of the plan. So there was a more than 25% cut between 1989 and the arrival of the administration in the defense budget. There were 600,000 fewer people in the duty military than at the beginning of the George H.W. Bush administration. Procurement dollars had been cut 50%, thereby taking advantage of the Reagan H.W. Bush buildup in equipment. And the leadership was absolutely crucial to doing that because the services did not want to go there. And Colin Powell recognized as chairman that it was going to be absolutely necessary to set some baselines for what the forces and equipment were going to look like. And Cheney was prepared to take names and execute people on the way. So you had, and the president gave them full support in that exercise. It is not something we have today, right? And if by some weird quirk of fate, this president is reelected to a second term, we won't have it in the second term. And we won't have it in the building, because the building will not do this alone unless the White House is prepared to say, here's a guideline. So thing one is leadership. Thing two is indeed, yes, set the limits in the out years. Do it going forward, right? So that the department knows what the limits are going to be on its assets in the future. They know the news before they re-adjudicate as they will every year, because that's the nature of the beast. They need to know what the target set is for a drawdown. So real long-term projection of aggregate resources, top line, for the department is going to be an essential second piece. And that comes back to the first point, which is leadership. And thirdly, and this is the hardest thing to achieve in the building, is to be honest with themselves, is inside the building to stem the inevitable tide of service self-defense and service jockeying and threat inflation and buggering thy neighbor. Set all of that agenda aside and with leadership, start doing the planning that leads to a clear and sustainable drawdown of capability following the budgetary guidance. If they don't do these things, all you're going to get is systemic warfare, a lot of fake messaging, a lot of running around with the Congress of the United States and running the White House. So White House leadership's essential. Pentagon leadership is essential. It may sound funny coming from me, but yearning for the institutional administrative strength that Dick Cheney and Colin Powell brought to the building at 1989. By the time the Clinton administration came in there, most of this job had been done. We also did another piece of it, which was to take another $124 billion out of the 4 years remaining in the fit-up, setting a long-term fiscal guideline for the department. The department didn't like it, not surprised, no department does, but they had planning guidance that they could work from. So, that to me is the essential diagram, and I don't see in this administration the leadership at the senior level that's actually going to execute that kind of a plan.
Dov?
Well, let me not look backward and just make some suggestions or lay out some thoughts. First, I think that it's given that we're talking about deficits well beyond anything we imagined before. I mean, just one bill alone gave us a $2 trillion payout, and there's going to be more coming. So we're in a different place. And I think that the first thing that has to be done is actually my old shop, the comptroller's shop, should have an execution review. And every penny that has not been spent, every penny that's not been obligated should be set aside, number one, and be the basis for the first set of cuts. And there should be cuts. Now, how should we cut? First of all, I think the Defense Department should be given a budget of no real growth, no annual growth, nominal growth. In other words, you're just not growing at all, which means real decline. That's number one. Who can do that? Well, Gordon's old shop can. And Mark Meadows, who's not exactly a defense spender, could be the guy that pushes this thing and convinces the president if the president's reelected. If the Democrats come in, I think you'll see this anyway. That's number one, an execution review. And anything that hasn't been spent, unless there's a phenomenally good reason, basis number one for what should become a no nominal growth budget over the 5 years. Next thing, we should avoid the cut drills that I've seen throughout my career, which is essentially cutting things that the services really don't like all that much and was forced down their throats or whatever. That's not how we can do it. We just don't have the wherewithal to get away with that nonsense anymore. And so this should be a centrally managed OSD, service is going to hate me for this, but OSD-led efficiency budget. Very different. And much of the emphasis should go on science and technology, because the flip side of all of this is that the Russians and the Chinese aren't going away, and we still need a capability to deal with them. But the way we're going now ain't going to be good enough. The only one who really seems to be ahead of the curve on this is David Berger, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and he hasn't implemented very much yet either. We need a budget that A, is forward-looking, and B, is implementable in a relatively short period of time. Third, we need to open up to the allies in a far more different way. They're no longer just a nice to have. We just aren't going to have enough stuff by ourselves. Just witness the TR, the carrier, and what's happened to it. We need to be totally coordinated. And if it means opening up a little bit of the classified kimono, by all means, it's worth doing that. And lastly, and Gordon just mentioned it very briefly, but I want to expand on it. You're not going to get any of this done without Congress. And we have to, just as we have to stop the game playing inside the department, we have to stop the game playing outside of the department. And that means that Congress has to get serious, and that's going to probably be the hardest nut to crack of all.
Todd, give us your sense. And it was very, very admirable that somebody, at least somebody, read the CARES Act. So I'm glad that you went through it. You and your team went through it with a fine-tooth comb. I thought you were becoming a little bit too much of a broad strategy analyst, but I'm glad to see that you still have those hardcore budget chops to wade your way through that.
Well, it's like 5 pages of the bill is defense, so it's not that hard.
I was trying to build you up a little bit.
No, what I would add to all this discussion is let's not repeat the mistake of 2012. What I'm talking about is when the Budget Control Act had already been passed. We knew what was coming. We knew we were going to be hit with a sequester. And Panetta, as SecDef, told the Pentagon, do not plan for sequester cuts. Do not plan for this. Turned out, to be a huge mistake. We knew what was coming. He was hoping that it wouldn't happen, and by not planning for it, it would make it even less palatable to Congress, but it happened anyway. So, hopefully it's disproven that theory that if we don't plan for it, people won't let it happen. I think this time around, the department would be smart to go ahead and start planning for a serious downturn. If that happens, just be prepared, know what the options are. Number one thing they can start doing right now to better position themselves for a downturn, don't grow in strength. Stop adding mouths to feed. That's the best thing they could do right now. I know the services say they need to grow their force structure, grow in strength in order to meet the demands of the NDS. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to sustain that. And what's more important, as Dov was alluding to, are the investments in the new technologies that we're going to need to be relevant, to keep the forces relevant in the future against countries like Russia and China and every other lesser country they sell their arms to. So if you want to protect those modernization investments, you have to start cutting in strength now. And the sooner you cut it, the more the payoffs will be in the future.
We're going to have to go in a bit of a round robin because we've got 10 minutes left. I want to go to Chris because we also have some breaking news about the commanding officer of USS Theodore Roosevelt, Captain Brett Crozier.
No, thanks, Vago. So this is just put out on Twitter, and other outlets are starting to pick it up from Reuters. It is expected that the commander of Theodore Roosevelt will be relieved within the day. It doesn't say that he has been relieved yet. And what Phil Stewart and Idris Ali are reporting is that he's going to be relieved because it's believed that he was the one that leaked the letter to the San Francisco Chronicle. So we'll see. I've been involved in enough of these reliefs to know that there's always layers to these, but this will not be received well. It'll be emblematic of what the White House and what leadership thinks of those folks at the unit level, regardless of what the real story is.
And the big issue there being, right, that Navy leaders yesterday, acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly, who's supposed to be making this announcement after we tape this, and the Chief of Naval Operations, Mike Gilday, said, hey, we ask commanding officers to be more honest, to come to us if they have problems and challenges. The commanding officer must not have been getting help to have been forced to write a letter like that. And there was a lot of different ways that letter could have been leaked. It didn't necessarily have to come from the ship. It could have come from, but obviously, right, NMCI allows you to track all of those messages and do some forensics on it. We'll get to that in a minute. You also had some thoughts on what this all means for the national defense strategy.
I think safe to say the national defense strategy is dead, if it ever was really alive. And I mean, we've heard that from all the all the folks that have preceded me. That there was question that once Secretary Mattis left, would it be able to grow and really take root? When the budget was rolled out, smart people like Todd and others, I think were were struck by how hard you had to really look to see where the connections to the strategy were. I think that any sort of growth, as Todd and others mentioned, is just not going to be possible. And in fact, in Navy circles, I mean, folks are already lamenting that we'll be likely to be closer to a 250 ship Navy than anything that resembles a 355 ship Navy.
Let me put this question to everybody. I mean, every single time in sort of recorded post-war, but you could even say pre-World War II memory, anytime the United States hasn't led, the whole world has had to basically clean up a mess. And if our intelligence services knew, as they did in December, about how bad the situation in Wuhan was, there was ample opportunity for the United States to react. And instead of just reacting and leading, the United States is almost actively pissing off its allies. I mean, when Mike Pompeo got up earlier this week and said, sort of demanding information from countries like, Italy and Spain, we demand data without which we can't fight this. I mean, Italy is a country 1/6 the size of the United States, and yet has been losing as many, 1,000 people a day consistently. It's a little bit hard, I think, for people to be maybe tabulating data and information as quickly as everybody might want that information at the end of the day. Talk to us about whether or not this is not perhaps the most emblematic issue of what happens when the United States is not in the forefront and grabs the reins even from, or uses every vehicle at their disposal to pressure countries to be more honest, accept aid, and respond. Or am I just being Pollyanna?
You're being Pollyanna.
You're being Pollyanna. Look, we're in a situation where this country's leadership wants to build walls at a time when, first of all, diseases penetrate everything, including walls, climb under, over, and around because they hit people. And secondly, because if you're going to beat this disease, you need maximum international cooperation. So, yeah, I mean, the leadership isn't there. And I don't see it happening, frankly, with this particular group of people in Washington.
I completely agree with Dov on that. This is not an administration that has ever shown a scintilla of interest in using allies, convincing allies that we were capable of leading, of working in multilateral institutions to coordinate this kind of response, and add to it, as we now know, that there was plenty of warning and gaming showing us that a pandemic would be a disaster, much of which never made it to the senior reaches of the government, never made it into investments and planning. And as I said at the beginning, we have an administration that is dedicated to the proposition that the airplane needs to be taken apart while it's flying, not built when it's flying. So it's an unnatural act now for them to be scrambling around on an improvisational level to try to rebuild an airplane they've been trying to take apart. There was not even an opportunity here for American leadership. And the more fundamental underlying issue here is we are really watching, as we've said many times on this program, a redistribution of power in the global environment. Other players are coming in, not just China, and they are playing a role in the global system and setting up systems. I was fascinated to read this week that the French, for the first time, have invoked an instrument they created more than a year ago to end run the American sanctions with the Iranians to get them some equipment that they wanted to get to the Iranians. But when countries outside the United States start building capacities to do things that do not include the United States because they can't rely on the United States, we are watching the disintegration of the system we knew and the evolution of a system we don't know yet.
Although in fairness, right, I mean, the United States has said we're willing to make this equipment available, and Iranian leaders have said, well, that equipment could further poison Iranians.
I didn't talk to that point because I don't think it's a question of fairness here. It isn't even a question of evidence. What I'm saying is a system is being created that is separate from the system the United States could lead in. And that's a fundamental change in the global system, regardless of how the Iranians foolishly or wisely respond to it.
Yeah, look, Vago, we have an opportunity to lead. We've always led NATO. It's not, we're not talking about leading in the EU or leading in the UN or leading in all those organizations that, you know, we've always been a little hesitant about. We've never been hesitant about NATO until this president came in. And that's where we have the opportunity to lead. And we're not doing it.
I want to have kind of the 5-minute version of this conversation, and I'd like to be able to come back to it. I suspect that Gordon and Dov, you guys are going to be in the vanguard of the question. At a time when the United States, right? I mean, let's just, for the sake of argument, there are a lot of reasons why Xi might decide to act, right? He's been very bruised. He was bruised by being forced to back down in Hong Kong. And remember, this is a guy who achieved or was granted a lifetime tenure by the Council of Elders that actually runs the country at a senior level, because he promised to stick it to the Americans and to be able to take Taiwan back. He was forced to back down in Hong Kong. He was forced to backtrack in Wuhan, where extraordinary amount of Chinese popular pressure was exerted and forced the party to do its first about-face ever. That's something the Chinese people will never forget. There are folks who are saying, well, we're going to move our factories out of China, which is then a further blow. It's not particularly clear whether the Chinese are going to be able to deliver on the trade deal they just signed because of the global economic meltdown. And so if you're a leader, almost every authoritarian leader delves into the playbook of find an external thing that can buoy you, whether you're Vladimir Putin or anybody else. Ultimately, how dangerous does China become in this case? And what does the United States and its allies have to do to ensure that the Chinese do not make a generational strategic miscalculation, right? How does the United States, at a moment when it might be flattened by coronavirus, whether it's military capabilities or other, what are the things Washington's going to start doing right now to make sure that nobody takes advantage of us at a time of weakness?
I don't think there are many things that we can do right now to stem the tide, because frankly, we don't even know how long this is going to last or the devastating trouble it's going to wreak around the world. Anything is possible. And that's what's really interesting about this crisis. Anything is possible. So I wouldn't rule out China doing something stupid, but I don't rule it in either. We have now expanded the parameters of unpredictability here in the extreme. I do believe that a lot of chest thumping by the United States against China right now stands in the way of the global cooperation that must happen if we're going to stem this virus. And leaders do seem to recognize that that is a necessary thing to have happen, but they're not being able to pull that together. So no, nothing can be ruled out. The uncertainty is very high. Chest thumping is clearly not the answer to what may or may not be the decision of the Chinese. But, I would have set a whole different tone for our relationship with China from the get-go if I'd been in this administration.
Right.
I would say this. There are a couple of things we can do.
But one thing, before I go to you, Deb, just 1 second. I mean, the one thing that I would also add is that's an exacerbating issue is the sense the Chinese have that the only thing the president of the United States cares about is a trade deal, and that he actually doesn't, and the president has said he didn't much care about Hong Kong. And even the president's supporters have been a little bit concerned that he might not be willing to come to Taiwan's defense either, right? And it becomes problematic if the adversary senses that, you might not be interested or back some of the rhetoric that has been accepted that the United States historically would do. Dov?
Well, on Taiwan, I would say that, the president reverses himself so often that if I were sitting in Beijing, I wouldn't necessarily take chances. Look how he's reversed himself on the coronavirus. But there are a couple of things that we could do if the president or his advisors convinced him to do. One is, as Gordon says, not merely tone down the rhetoric vis-a-vis China, but actually talk to Xi more and more often. Now, the president boasts that he speaks to Xi. Well, I would do it on a weekly basis to the point where there's real cooperation between us and the Chinese. That's one way to minimize the likelihood of the Chinese doing something stupid. At the same time, the president really does need to reach out to all his allies and show that we are a reliable ally. That's going to be a message to both China and Russia. So by doing both of those things, yes, you can't predict that the Chinese won't do anything stupid, or for that matter, that the Russians won't try to seize Estonia or something. But you're minimizing the risk that that might happen. Whether this president and the people around him are willing to do that, of course, is an open question at best.
Dov and I are in violent agreement on this. I just don't expect this administration to have the savvy or the wisdom to do something so sensible.
Well, look, I mean, the challenge is the president has some very, very good advisors who are very tough on China and are realistic and sensible about it. The question is whether their boss shares that sentiment. We have to talk to Todd in a second, but Chris, you get 30 seconds. Is the United States military in 3 months' time going to be in a position where it can actually execute the way the nation will expect it to execute at the end of the day, given how this virus is spreading?
I think it will be. I mean, I really do. I mean, I think unless things go horribly wrong, given the age demographic and given what we know about the virus, I don't think we would be at 100%, but I do think that the military would be able to make do and figure out how best to either defend the homeland or significantly defend U.S. interests. Question will be, how much will we break it or try to break it to keep it at some level of readiness? And then, what happens afterwards? I'm more worried about the fiscal ramifications of this than I am of the virus causing, health and welfare issues among the force. Maybe that's short-sighted, but that's kind of where my focus is.
And then, of course, how the relief of Captain Crozier then affects people and their willingness to want to stick their heads up and raise concerns. Going to be very, very interesting to watch that. Todd, you've been very, very patient. Talk to us a little bit about the Space Threat Assessment, CSIS's annual flagship products, you and your team.
Our annual Space Threat Assessment, we just released it on Monday. This year's update, of course, includes new activities by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. We also added a chapter on India, in part because of their direct ascent ASAT test last year about this time. And then we also included new sections on France and Japan, which have gotten into the space reorganization game, creating their own version of space units within their military. But then also France talking very publicly about the fact that they plan to deploy defensive counter space weapons to protect their satellites. So they've been pretty out there on that. So we're actually going to be...
and that was because Russians have operated in very close and parked proximity to one of their spacecraft, right?
Exactly, yes. So the Russian Lush satellite has been transiting around geostationary orbit, snuggling up close to lots of satellites, a lot of Intelsat satellites, but also happened to, in 2017, get up close to a French-Italian military satellite. And that set France, back thinking on how are they going to defend their critical space assets like that satellite, and led to a release this past summer of 2019, of a new space defense strategy. And the French minister of the armed forces came out and said that they were planning to deploy bodyguard satellites in space and high-powered lasers on satellites to defend their systems. And so, a lot of activity going on. There are many other updates like this in our report. I'll also plug the virtual event we are doing. Since we can't meet in person, we're going to have an online webinar on Monday that folks can tune into. Got to register for that in advance, but you can find that on our website at aerospace.csis.org, and happy to answer more questions there.
Absolutely, and you're welcome on anytime. Everybody, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Thank you to the audience for listening as long as you all did. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vago.
Take care.
Thanks, Vago.
Thanks, Vago.
Thanks very much for joining us. Check out our interviews on our website as well as our daily podcast. Look for the weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to all of you for listening and to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.